everybody. We are going to introduce our next speaker now, Jared Pfost at and he's going to talk to us about how to measure and communicate risk. So everyone, please welcome Jared.
Thank you. Yeah, my grandpa used to say that F is silent like the P in swimming. That's his old joke. So let's jump in. So I've been in InfoSec for a long time, shipped a lot of software. I've been a practitioner at a few organizations. The last one was Washington Mutual, and when they had their grand collapse, they decided to set off and build tools to manage security teams. And I had this funny, amusing anecdote about reverse engineering my 8-year-old's toy robot. But then late Sunday, I saw this tweet, and I decided to try and have my opening story be profound. So here goes. The tweet was from @hacksec, and it was RSA, blah, blah, blah. So I checked it out, but it wasn't the RSA that I was familiar with. It was the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts. And they have a series of TED-like talks. So I checked it out, and I saw one that really grabbed my eye, and I thought it folded nicely with this presentation. It was all about what drives us. And I'm sure he would puke if he saw my clip art representation of his research. It basically says, if you're stamping widgets or paving roads, traditional motivators work really well, carrots and sticks. And they work really well for a short time for more complex and ambiguous tasks. But over time, they suck. But what does work is these concepts of autonomy, that we want to be the masters of our own domain. Don't give us a checklist. We want to figure out what the problem is ourselves. Mastery, this desire that we want to get better every day, see the ball move forward, make progress. And purpose, that we're part of something larger than ourselves. We're not just a cost center, we actually contribute to something. So put this in context of my opinion of the last 15 years for information security spending. This is exactly wrong, but it's just my opinion to set up a point. So in the 90s, it was just Hackfest, and we were having fun. Nobody paid attention to us. But then when the economy and the tech bubble really started to go, things changed dramatically. And I think we actually overspent because the focus was on technology instead of maturing processes. But that all changed in 2007. And the reality that the slope probably isn't that steep, but I worked for a bank at the time, so that's my bias. And I think it's getting better. But the point here is that if you don't have these resources and you're within this increasing risk environment, I call this the hair pulling zone. So when you're stuck into that position there, that's when it's really hard to have autonomy and mastery and to have a purpose. So to set expectations for this talk real quick, when you're in an organization where security doesn't matter, and something happens, and then security matters, and then it doesn't matter, and that keeps going, what I want to share is specific techniques that you can use today or tonight at the party to measure, communicate risks that drive decisions, and to break out of that loop. So the first step is, if we're not winning, if we feel like we're losing, what does winning look like? And within your organizations, do you have something published that says, this is what success looks like for us? I bet Bob has something like that. No? So here's a definition that I've been using for quite a while, this first one. Avoiding unacceptable risks in the most efficient manner. And depending on your organization, you might have these other implicit definitions of success that I've seen. Just good enough to get that certification, or we're gonna fight like hell to get compliant between the pre-audit and the final audit. But I want to focus on this first one, because it's really neat. Avoiding unacceptable risks in the most efficient manner. And that implies that we know what the acceptable risks are. And that's where I think we can make a lot of progress. So much, I think this is so important that I put it up here with themes that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years. So I was beating the drum 5 or 6 years ago about proactive security. We've got to be proactive, stop responding to auditors. It was a nice theme, but how did that work out for us? And I really embrace and appreciate this theme over the last couple years, this assume breach theme. We need to focus on detection, response, and containment. I think the next step, or a very complement to that, is this concept of accepting risk. We have to be able to embrace the level of security that we do have and operate in this assumed breach mode. So now before we get into all the little details, I want to have a big disclaimer here. There's nothing miraculous or new here. You don't need fancy GRC platforms or even best-of-breed tools. I did all this for years in Excel. And when I thought about this point, it reminded me of a tweet a couple months ago. I think it was either from Gene Kim or Corman, and the theme was, supply isn't the issue. The issue is demand. And I don't even, he's here. So were you even talking about risk management at the time? Excellent. So with close enough, I made it. So here's the outline for the rest of this talk. So if we want to drive to get to these treatment decisions, where we're either going to accept something or not, we're going to walk through these steps. Prioritizing risk, equally important, prioritizing what we think we should do about it. Once that treatment decision has been made, now how do we complete that workflow? And the complement is measuring control performance. If we don't know how well we're performing, how do we know if we need more or less of it? And it's such an underrepresented art and practice. I think we need to focus on that. So I'm going to start with what's easy with data that we have and show how we can progress and justify and demonstrate value over time. So starting off with prioritizing risk. And I start off with the boring process model. I'm not going to go through this. It's not the point. The point is, you need to sit down with 30 minutes with Visio and figure out how your team is going to answer those fundamental questions. What are we protecting? What are we afraid of? From who? Why? How is it going to happen? What should we do about it? How all the constituents work with those questions, this really helps. If you don't have this, they're going to be stepping all over themselves with your architects and your assessors and your hotshots and your auditors and your constituents. You need to be able to fit them in this process so you know where they belong. So who here prioritizes risk? Anybody? Most folks. Have you ever just taken a few minutes and done a little swim lane diagram of the process from when you do your threat model to you go with your control owners and your business owners and you reach a treatment decision? Excellent. Few people admit it. So I really encourage you to do this. It helped me a ton. Oh, I did want to share one management hack. So we added this one extra little step to the process flow. And I call this is it the right person making the decision? Ace in the sleeve. So you have to publish this before you go through that treatment process. And this doesn't say that we disagree with the decision. It says, is this the right person making the decision? So let me give you a hypothetical example. So say you're doing a line of business application assessment. And when you're going through the analysis, you find this file share with some critical information on it with access permissions set to all authenticated users. So you explain this to the owner. He says, hey, I understand the risk, but there's dependencies here. We don't have a lot of time. There's some automation involved. I'm going to accept this risk. We're going to put it on a list somewhere. And so then you can say, I understand, but given the potential impact of this information is actually larger than just your line of business, I'm going to go, have this discussion with so-and-so. So assuming you've already talked to so-and-so and said, hey, if I see a risk that looks like this, is it okay if I run this past you? You have to have that pre-conversation. You need to know the answer before you ask the question. And they're probably going to say yes. So if you do that, something miraculous does happen. Then that control owner, once he knows that this might happen, he'll say, I think we can fit that in. We're going to get that in the next cycle to update the permissions on that share. That little management hack is, once you introduce someone's personal career performance or their goodwill, as they have to have that conversation with management, I've allocated a lot of security money that way. So continuing on the boring process techniques, this is my friend, the RACI diagram. For every action, every one of those little process box, they get a row in this table, and you put your, who's actually accountable, who's responsible to execute, who contributes, who's informed. And this example, this will be wrong for this presentation. This is actually to prioritize bugs from the development process. I presented this to a Microsoft audience. And it's pretty funny. So I'm going through the very detailed technical RACI with this mixed audience, and the program managers in the room, they get the poor souls responsible for scope and schedule. They're like, yeah, RACI, that's really good. I could use this stuff. And the developer's like, RACI? That's like the name of my online girlfriend. I don't need RACI. And so the trick here is, by all means, do this. It's really helpful to break ties. When you need to butt heads, you have to know how to move forward. But if your culture and your politics isn't going to support a little overhead tool like this, just keep it in your desk and roll it out implicitly. I don't want you embarrassing yourself with the technologists in the room. So the next step is you have to have a risk taxonomy. You need a common vocabulary, whether it's NIST or FAIR or ISO or this, it doesn't matter. You need a way to organize the tactical evidence, and it has to be structured, across our impacts and our frequencies. I mean, how many people have a common risk taxonomy in their org that, when somebody abuses it, they can point to and say, terminology violation? A couple? If you don't, I really encourage you to standardize on something. In fact, I used to play a couple tricks with my teams, just when it's, say, the security architects. We'd say, all right, when we talk about these things, we're not going to use the R word. We talk in terms of frequencies and impacts and their subcomponents, but nobody say the R word. It was a great exercise to get people to realize where on this taxonomy they're actually referring to. And we had another rule, when we're prioritizing things, it doesn't go on the whiteboard unless there's evidence in both of these categories. And really try and minimize the opinion and personal preference on that. So here is my favorite slide of all time. And did anybody see the sexy defense session yesterday? Go check it out on video if you're watching on video, because I wish I could just take I gotta meet this guy, take that whole session and just, bam, put it right here. It was fantastic. And none of this whole assessment process works without evidence. And I think there's two kinds of evidence that matter, not the compliance requirements. There's a kind of evidence that finds you, right? Incidents happen. Hopefully you understand who the agent is. You know that there was a vulnerable system because there was some impact. But then there's most of the other evidence, and you have to go find it. It doesn't happen. You have to prioritize resources to go get that evidence. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of opinions flopped around about risk. So attack and pen assessments. If you don't have a best friend on the attack and pen team, you need to get there. I bought those guys more beer over my professional career than anything. It was the best investment I ever made. I mean, if you think about it, name me a risk that you can't pay somebody a modest amount of money to go see if that asset's vulnerable. It's really hard to do. So then the only thing left is there a motivated agent? I mean, you really cut down a lot of the uncertainty on that risk conversation for the frequency side. And we're going to talk more about that later. Metrics as well, and intelligence services. It's been really interesting to see this industry grow over the last few years. Because, as I mentioned, you can do testing to see if things are vulnerable, but you need to have an idea if people care out there. I mean, how many folks here have engaged a service where there's an organization out there just looking for evidence of you in the underbelly of the internet? Anybody? I recommend checking that out. It's served a lot of folks well. So by the time we work up, the PowerPoint pyramid of evidence, by the time we get to peer incidents as an opinion, this is really just flavor. What's going to be actionable is making it personal to your decision makers. So now once we have that backdrop, the next step is building the risk narrative. Right, so we have our evidence, it's organized into our neat little taxonomy, and this is something that I still, kind of struggle with. I still need to improve as a professional. How do we translate all those little subcomponents into a written narrative and then to an oral narrative that's appropriate for the decision maker? And it takes a lot of practice. And I would have used the Veris A4 model here, but Verizon won't open source their taxonomy. So let's just call it the grabber. Not for commercial copyright use, so my company can't use it, but your company can. Okay, well then next version of this presentation, I'll use it. So essentially, how do we take the components of that risk statement and translate that into sentences? Criminals copying payment card through our web apps. It's this type of asset. It's going to have this type of impact. That's the grabber. Then get a nice sentence around that. Then we're going to back it up with some details. This is why this happened. This is how it happened. And then the most important part, if you still have their attention, and here's why it matters to you. Here's our evidence. We found X amount of vulns. We have, there's evidence of a motivated attacker in this space by X example. And once we know how to translate technical evidence into a narrative, now we can finally start communicating in context. So notice I've been 5 slides into risk, and I haven't talked about risk models. And that's really intentional, because that's where I think the risk model sits on the priority list of keys to success. So here let me introduce the old donkey, the old workhorse, user-defined ordinal value system. And then a really nice visual, I took this from some work that Jay Jacobs and Chris Hayes did called OpenPert to communicate using this distribution. Who here uses the good old ordinal-based heat map? Only one person? How about using distributions? I know at least 3 people that I can see in the audience. So excellent. So, as I mentioned, these are communication vehicles, and I could not be more agnostic about which model to use. It really depends on your decision makers. Which of these models is going to resonate with your stakeholders to reach a decision? So, you look over it, and I'll talk about their strengths and weaknesses for a bit. You look at the ordinal value system, and you're like, hey, this is pretty cool. I can see all these risks relative to each other on one nice little picture. These risks, they're mapped to these color bands. We have history with these color bands, so we have precedents. We have some examples, so I can understand what is the impact and frequency of this issue. It's very cool. But then on the other hand, it's like, wait a minute. If I want to see how much money is actually at risk, I got to pull up this guide that says, a 4 and a 5 is $50,000 and has all these qualitative attributes to it. That's kind of a pain. And then wait a minute, these look like discrete values, but this is a nonlinear scale. I don't really know if a 4 or 5 is twice or 3 times worse than a 7 or 8. So in order to understand that, I've got to go back to my scale and say, oh, nope, 7 or 8 is actually $10 million, and a 4 and a 5 is $3 million. So again, it's a nice communication vehicle, but in order to be actionable, you have to pull out that story and understand the details. And a lot of folks miss that. You can't let them miss that. Similarly with the distribution, it's like fantastic, right? A 50% chance of $35,000. 10% of the time, it's going to be $75,000. Super crystal clear. And I can also see, what is the range of impact over my accumulated distribution? So sometimes that really resonates with stakeholders, and it's powerful. But wait a minute, where do these costs come from, or what are the other qualitative attributes? You got to pull those details out. And also, these are distributions of expert opinion. These aren't actual, what is the distribution of, real vulnerabilities being exploited? And some people have a challenge with that. We're multiplying dependent variables of impact, and one sec, Patrick, I'll get to you, of frequency and impact. Some people have a problem with that from a statistics standpoint. So, you have to be able to articulate these in a way that's going to work. Yes, Patrick.
Are the heat map values any less expert opinion?
No, not at all. So the question was, are the heat map values any less expert opinion? No, the point here was, this isn't the distribution of the actual exploits, successful exploits. It's a distribution representing the opinions of the expert. That was the distinction there.
Okay. So we'll talk about it later.
Okay. The one thing that these do have in common, though, in a nice way, it's evidence in decisions out. The pessimistic way is garbage in, garbage out. So, because in my experience, so many more people use that user-defined ordinal scale, I wanted to highlight some of the weaknesses. So as I mentioned, it's nonlinear. So a way to combat that is, don't be a victim of your own risk model. Put put references in there or even allocate some space that says this frequency is way different than the other ones, or this impact is a huge outlier. Make sure you note that so your visual doesn't overwhelm your real story. Edge cases. So take the denial of service attack. You've got an annoying denial of service attack, and you've got cripple your ISP, content distribution network denial of service attack. Instead of trying to represent that as this range of impacts, just separate them out. You've got annoying DDoS, you've got catastrophic. So separate that out, that risk, even if it's the same agent. Typically, if you get a different agent or different vulnerability, it represents a new risk. Don't be afraid to do that based on degree of impact. These color bands. So a common criticism and failure is, I'm going to pay attention to the bottom of the red, and then I'm going to ignore the top of the orange, right? It's in a different color band, but they're really close together. So again, don't be a victim to that. Those color bands are there to help from a precedent standpoint. These things we typically mitigate. Those areas of the orange, we typically make a judgment decision based on the evidence we have. We should be able to accept things in the red, we should be able to mitigate things in the orange, etc. And that's, again, it's a process standpoint. Combining quantitative and qualitative values. You need to be able to incorporate all those risk taxonomy items that build your risk narrative. You'd have to incorporate those into your ordinal scale definitions, just so you can help somebody, show them a story so they can communicate their story. And also what's handy about that is that it's easy to align to other potential heat maps roaming around in your organization. So if you have an enterprise risk management group, they've got an even higher level evil ordinal heat map. And then, of their 5 or 7 dots, one of them is operational risk, and you represent some set of operational risk. You need to be able to have a bridge from your prioritization into theirs. So it's a lot easier, when you have that defined scale with monetary and qualitative segments. So, aside from detailed questions, any more questions on this? Okay, cool. So I want to highlight a couple things, or just techniques. I won't go through. I just created some tiny little snippets from an ordinal guide. So on the impact side, I wanted to share the importance of precedent and example. Help people understand if the impact looks like this, usually fits in this type of color band. If the impact is something that's going to be of material value versus just affected department. And that's a story that people can kind of snap to. But the impact side is really valuable once you've done this for a certain period of time. The other benefit of that color band, I forgot to mention, it's a good feedback loop. So hey, in this color band, we decided to accept that risk. So when you come back the next year, you should be checking yourself and say, was that the right move? So where I think people get stuck a lot is on the frequency side. Impact, we can interview business owners, we can kind of get a calibrated estimate for how they feel, or we can look at peer incidents. But on the frequency side, this is kind of the domain of the InfoSec professional, right? What is the frequency of this bad thing happening? And in my experience, there's really only 3 buckets. I don't need to get wrapped around the axle of an ARO of 0.5 or 0.6 or 0.45, because we either have a vulnerability that can be exploited, and we have a motivated agent. So if we have those 2 things, we've got a high-frequency situation. Right? If we only have one of those things, somewhere in the middle, it's like, hey, we found a vulnerable system, but it requires inside knowledge, and it's really difficult to exploit, and we have these compensating controls. We don't really, our intelligence service and our history says we don't have a motivated agent going after this asset. It's easy to put that in that second category. If you don't have either of those, hey, we can't reproduce this vulnerability, we don't know of a motivated agent, it's going to be in that low frequency bar. And in my experience, it really just comes down to those 3 decisions.
So you find by reducing it to that number, basically, 3 versus whatever the ordinance scale you might use,
Right.
does it reduce the need or eliminate the need for calibration sessions then, or going through calibration exercises, or do you still
think more calibration, the better, right? Because you still need separation in there. There's not just three big clumps of things to worry about. You're going to separate them based on your professional, calibrated expert opinion. Yeah, that's a good question. So let's put some of this into action. So something easy, like the single event risk. So and how it's used on the old donkey here. So here I've got some risks associated with our e-commerce environment, segregation of duties, access certification. I just want to highlight, hey, here's some of the risk narrative for this one called app vulnerabilities. It's similar to what the narrative I showed earlier. We've got the grabber, then we're going to have the details, and then we'll have our evidence. So behind this, this is great. It shows what this visual is, but there's a story behind it. And this is where we leverage that risk taxonomy. And it doesn't matter which model we're using, quantitative distributions or user-defined ordinals. We have to be able to walk through the attributes of that taxonomy to make judgments on it, expert opinions. So, part of the risk model that I use, when we're looking for, is this a vulnerable asset, I really like the NIST Common Vulnerability System. I don't use the scores, I just like their categories, right? So, based off this evidence in that risk that we had on the heat map, is the access vector remote, the complexity is trivial, is an injection attack, the authentication is weak, ubiquitous, etc. And so the value of this qualitative guide is just to make sure there's some consistency, that we're asking the same questions, we're thinking about them in the same way across all those diverse risks that we have. But who gives a crap about that? What's important is the evidence that you have. That qualitative taxonomy, no matter what the end communication result, if it's in a distribution or ordinal, helps give us some consistency. So then we can walk through, all right, so if we think we're vulnerable, how effective are we at controlling this? So here's an approach, and I know some people hate this, but again, the maturity of that control is just to make sure we're considering all the different control categories that's in the standard. Are we measuring this? Is there some kind of awareness? Do we have the people process technology? But again, it doesn't matter. What matters is the evidence that we find during that assessment. And then finally, on the impact side, depending on what direct and indirect impact categories you have, we just need to make sure for every risk we're considering each of them. Only one of them might be relevant, but hey, at least we understand that. And again, it doesn't matter. We're going to follow what's going to actually enable some non-technical person who has to allocate money across competing interests. You have to make it personal with them with some kind of evidence. Any questions on those three slides? So let's do something a bit more complex. This is a really popular one over the last year ago, I'd say. So say we have this traditional advanced adversary scenario. It's been replicated so many times since the Aurora with the shady rat and whatnot. And it follows a pretty similar pattern. And traditionally, we used to kind of test these in isolation. How effective is my awareness? How effective is my device management and my authorization and my egress filtering, etc.? But what these attacks really highlighted is that given a certain adversary and their attributes, they don't care. They're going to use these in a sequence of events. So, how do you test the frequency of success here? So, in my simple world, pay somebody 40 grand and you say, knock yourself out. Here's the asset you're going after, and we would like you to, look at these series of assets. But if that doesn't work, go around and find something else. And just you don't say it out loud, but take a guess on what percentages of those organizations that went through this red teaming test that the tests are successful. Don't say it out loud, I said. So then, now we can come back and say, well, we have a pretty good idea how vulnerable we are. Is there a motivated asset? And we can go look in our other evidence sources. And it also gives us a nice way of saying, all right, where do we invest? So we can walk that chain and look at our control maturity in each one and say, where's the biggest bang for the buck? And that's the exercise that's going on right now. So this is how we get evidence. How would you communicate that with this view in this ordinal heat map? So we've got this big chain of things that lead to loss of intellectual property, but it's dependent on all these different control failures. So in my experience, you just keep it simple. We don't try and associate conditional probabilities. If A happens, then it's going to be probability that B happens versus C, etc. We have our individual risks, and then you just make one that's specific to advanced adversary, intellectual property theft, and the details. We have the steps, the different events, in the various terminology that occur, and the evidence associated with those. Any questions on that? I think it's been a really effective way to communicate that. So here's a little visual I've had for some while, and it's about adversaries and control maturity. And I actually used to have hacktivists there in the lower left until I saw Josh's keynote, and I realized I was thinking too narrow. So it's chaotic actors now. And I've really been impressed over the last year and a half with people's ability to really separate agents and adversaries out. And that really didn't happen 5 years ago and in the past, in my experience. And so this resonates really well of control maturity and spend based on adversaries that are interested in you. So easy point, but make sure that your stakeholders are thinking about this. So I've tons of slides and 30 minutes on a lot of it on risk prioritization. But this is an equal part of the decision process. It's all right, we have an advanced adversary scenarios, but we also have awareness. Bob Rubin showed us a kick-ass awareness program where we can't just keep our existing CBT, we have to spend money there. So what I highly recommend is that you have a construct that prioritizes things where risk is just a component. And I rarely see money spent on security risk alone. So we used to have a weighted average construct. I just like a straight average construct because the values don't matter. What matters is the story behind them. So risk is going to have a play. Your internal politics are going to have a play. Do you even have capacity to understand this? Is the business going to support it? It's like, nope, they really want their mobility versus more PCAP analysis. Sometimes, for political reality, I'm amazed on how often money is being spent on irrelevant risks because money's already been spent. Hey, we already promised to spend that money. Or maybe there was an efficiency gain. There's all kinds of reasons to spend money, and we need to be able to document for posterity why we did that. And of course, cost. It's just too expensive. So I've seen a lot of initiatives like things like, we need to build a SOC, or we need to outsource to a SOC. But then they actually, if they're doing a risk-based budget, they say, we're not going to take all of our budget and outsource a SOC. So it's a function to be able to chunk these items up and say, nope, we're going to do stage 1 pilot versus the whole thing. And that's one way to avoid shelfware. You get allocated all this budget, you don't have resources to actually execute. Sometimes that happens. So related to that, I wanted to share this. About 10 years ago, somebody introduced this concept to me, and I think it saved my career in InfoSec. And it was this idea that, hey, based on anything above that firefight between the pre-audit and the post-audit, and anything outside of that is discretionary. It's our job to see if the business wants it. We could be a team of 5 and get by, but we're a team of 50 and we do all these things. That's all discretionary. So, whether it's all these things that we think that's important, hey, just to get to a degree of service where we wouldn't be considered negligent, when we're sued. But if we want to do things like help the business make risk-based decisions, or heaven forbid, do a risk-based budget and the security team, all of our internal consulting projects from consumerization and SDL and monitoring and all that stuff, process improvement work, if it gets denied, I don't pull my hair out anymore. I just say, as long as the business understands the opportunity cost, then I'm cool with it. So, in one organization actually divided the security budget up into these items. And it was a very cleansing exercise just to see. So once that treatment decision has been made, then that risk takes another step in the workflow. So then it goes into the closet where all the other skeletons hang out. And that risk has a status and it's going to need to be revisited. Are we actively mitigating this or more? Do we consider this mitigated? It's not on the investment list anymore. We've just accepted this risk. Or hey, it's new and we need to be watching this. So any spreadsheet can do this. Another nice feature of this is it's a good catcher's mitt. So when you read the article in the Wall Street Journal, the call comes down and they say, hey, should we be concerned about this? You say, excuse me, here's this, and you get a day to analyze it, and you put it in context of, based on our risk register, here's where this thing really concerns us. And when I was taking those calls, more often than not, it was 20 or 30 on the list, and it really helped send that message to the executive. So, before I get into what my latest passion is on measurement, any questions while they're top of your mind on the risk prioritization?
I was just going to reinforce the previous slide. And you call it skeleton, but you actually articulated how these actually really aren't skeleton, or maybe they're a live skeleton, or whatever.
Yeah.
But that spreadsheet, the active content spreadsheet you were talking about, or view the GRC portal, whatever it is, I mean, basically, don't. This is one of the most important slides to start up, I think, because all these things got rated, accepted, or whatever. Yet every single day that change the status of these things. So doing a dynamic analysis of these things is hugely important because it really helps people understand these are living, breathing things that do change over time, and things may move up or down depending on what actually occurs. And they can't just be skeletons; they actually need to be undead things that we slay.
Right. And just a sec, so for those on the camera, what Bob said, or all I heard was, Jared, most important. No, he basically said, don't undersell this. These need to be living, breathing items that are going to go up and down based off new feedback. They don't just collect dust. And to that point, I used to have, on a quarterly process, I'm going to revisit this. On an annual process, we're going to use it for the budgeting period. So.
I had a similar thought, which was, if you were to time lapse this living, breathing thing,
Yeah.
you'd see ebb and flow. So, for example, what was the exposure to DDoS and SQL attack for Sony prior to suing you?
Yep.
And so, my fear when we see these people rest on these, and they clutch to them like a security blanket or a whoopee, and they don't understand that some of these adversaries are less predictable.
Right.
Maybe you don't need DDoS 365, but you need it during holiday season.
Yep.
I don't think we look at the temporal nature of these scores.
Yeah, so if I can summarize that is, don't get lulled into a sense of comfort by the temporal nature. Think that the environment is dynamic, right? These things are going to be changing, and that's the whole point of what we're here for, right? We have intelligence services, we assess. It's kind of, we're passionate about what we do. We try and stay plugged into the community. We have to get that intel back into this view because that's one thing that helps drive the money. Is that fair to say? Good, thank you. So an area that I'm more passionate than I should be about, so I referenced the awareness presentation before. So what was your favorite part about that? For mine, it was when he said, we have X% more or X% less, because that just showed you that he's not just all good looks, that this is actually being measured, right? We can see, are we moving the bar forward? So it's the same thing from a spending standpoint. So did anybody see the, Brian Kiefer and I did a presentation at B-Side San Francisco called MoneySec Evolved. Anybody see that? A lot of the content is similar, but in particular the clip art. It got such a rave review there, I had to bring it back on this one. So we're going to kind of step into this. But before we do, a couple of rules. And the first rule is, if you're going to have a metric, it must have a target. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. I've seen too many people make this mistake. So I don't care what the target is. It can be completely wrong, but you have to start somewhere to get that feedback loop going. And the benefits of that target, so we have actuals and then where we want to go, is that at the moment that's acceptable performance. That's a negotiation between you and the control owner, whether it's patching or user awareness incidents or access management. It doesn't matter. But based on your knowledge today, this is the performance you think is a message that we can lead with, and then there's a story behind it. So that said, for those, how many folks have a metrics program? Excellent. So over half. And how much would you say that is a mature metrics program? You're measuring everything that you think you should be. All right, so no one raised their hand. And I think that's a very common case. So what we tried to do is find out, all right, what is the smallest group of things to measure that we could come up with, justify value, and then expand that as needed. And this was the list. So the first one is you have to be able to have a baseline of incidents. In other words, I should have asked this. How many people have a baseline of their incidents that are categorized? We know one person does. So I was, I don't know, I shouldn't say surprised because we did a pretty crappy job at some of the places I worked at as well. It really takes some leadership to say, we're going to go back over the last 18 months, and we're going to classify annoying incidents. Hey, there was a malware infection, but did we do some analysis to see if there's a rootkit on it, and if there was any impact from that event, from a line of business impacting event to an executive aware event, low, medium, high. But you've got to do that. You have to establish that baseline to demonstrate value in improving other controls. Now, if you do development in-house, post-application security bugs are a nice way. It's data that you have. It's easy to get through your assessment process that you probably already have. Then as you get those incidents, you can make those correlations. You can use that data for your future awareness programs. It'll be valuable in many ways. But my favorite, because everybody has this data, is scan vulnerabilities. So patch and config vulns, but we had a little wrinkle, not mitigated within a specific time frame. So of people who scan their networks, do you have some pre-negotiated service level with your ops team by asset class or environment and vuln severity? Well, so the guy that keeps raising his hands, how long can your most critical vulnerability live on your most critical environment? 30 days. Excellent. I knew he was going to say something. So now...
Are these calibrated scans? Or are these just... Because I hate... And I'm not picking on you specifically. But I'm almost anti-scan because most people just run like Nessus out of the box. Sorry, I picked on Nessus. But, and let it fly and do no calibration of the scans. And therefore, whatever it says is law, and you do this stuff when in reality it's not actually attuned to... or calibrated to what you actually are supposed to be doing with the
Yeah, good point. So to repeat the question, he said, I'm picking on you. And he said, is this just, he didn't say that, is this all, you scan the report and you throw it over the wall? It's like, no, I'm assuming that there's some integrity in your vulnerability management manager and that they're actually triaging these, taking out the false positives, the scanoscoped appropriately.
Never make that assumption.
Good point. I shouldn't make that assumption. So let it be said. Yes?
When you talk about high, moderate, and annoying incidents, high, moderate, annoying what?
Right, so typically, within, I bet this guy's policy.
I mean, it was highly expensive to mitigate. It was just personally under my skin.
Correct. So, for example, what are the attributes to define what the category of event, right? You have events that lead to incidents. So, we used to have a number of items. Obviously, outage is number one in the IT shop. Then we'll go into, was it service availability? Or then was there any other type of compromise? Did it slow down production? Was it a security event? Did it affect? And, we used to have a thing where this...
Those adjectives modify the word impact in your mind.
For sure.
Impact and modify, you didn't say that. So
I'm sorry. I kind of took it for granted. I thought that a lot of people had these things. It's a good point.
I understood. So
It's a great point.
I thought I understood something about risk, but I'm shaking my head.
No, it's a very good point.
Yeah.
Right. You can get mad at me, but Alex and I beat the crap out of that critical patch launcher because the available failure data showed that it was the first EBR was 20% were patchable, then it was 6 total
Right.
were patchable, then 0 were patchable. Then this year there's a single digit patchable out of 900 incidents. So
Right.
everybody's measuring this really, really easy thing, and none of the exploits have that.
Correct. So
Josh,
So
maybe later. I'm just saying, we shouldn't confuse easy with most important. That's the
correct. So the point was, don't confuse easy with most important when it comes to patching, especially the time to vulnerability research that came out. That was that goes right along with what you're saying. And scanners are going to pick up a lot more than just patches, right? And you need to make sure that that patch state matches your reality. So very good point. I mean, because one of the vulns in the DBIR was default creds, right? Like at least your scanner is going to pick up on that one. So this added wrinkle of days is a kind of a unique governance tool. It's something that 10 years ago we used it with great success. So here's what this allows you to do. I think this is the biggest bang for the buck on your measurement program. So, instead of just congratulating somebody for how many vulns they fixed, once we have that asset and service level agreement, we can then just measure performance against it. So there's a competitive view there. For your front office or back office or external sites, how well are they performing mitigating these vulns? You have the data, take advantage and just age it and show which ones are overdue. And the goal here is to take the emotion out of the conversation and just say, hey, let's understand, is this a one-off event or is there a process problem here? So it's not just by asset group. You can then show the distribution. It's like, hey, you've got this bunch of vulns approaching their due date, or here's what the tail is. Let's understand why, you've got something that's over a year old or this big bunch that's 60 days old. So it's to have a data-driven approach to this thing. And this was our one picture for governance in our vulnerability management program. Any questions on this? Does anybody think this is as cool as I do? I've got a couple nods for the camera. All right, so I won't have time to go through all the metrics at this level of detail, but these are pretty much the same list that we shared at B-Sides. And remember, each one of these has to have a target. I don't care what it is, you have to draw a line in the sand. So access management, are credentials being revoked within a certain amount of time? Percent of the roles where you verified access. Like, I don't even care what it is, I want to make sure that at least somebody's being checking some population of that. On the network side, so for your prioritized environment, how much is that being monitored and to what degree? If you leverage a lot of vendors, have they been prioritized and are you assessing them on a periodic basis? And what is the performance of managing those findings again? I don't even know what they are here, but to start out, how's our performance of managing them? On the employee side, I'm going to go check out I heard there's a SANS list for metrics around awareness. I found that's a hard one. One approach I'd like to take is duplicates. So when we see repeat events or incidents from an awareness standpoint, let's highlight those and use that data back into the education programs we have. Do you have this one?
Yeah, for this particular one, the one that we're focusing on now is repeat virus offenders as an example for a repeat incident.
Excellent. So the example was, hey, we've got repeat virus incidents. So, people that got a itchy click finger, I guess. And then a page out of the DevOps book, emergency changes with a regression, just from a rugged standpoint. And there's one organization in the world that I know of that's actually reached kind of that third step, this run, where they've gone back. They have at least 18 months worth of history for comparing actuals, and then they can come back and say, hey, was this target right? So if they had a 98% target for server patching, what would it do to our risk posture if we lower that to 80? What if we skipped a Tuesday? We'd still capture and we make sure we capture our critical vulns within 30 days. What if we saved ourselves 6 test and deploy cycles for Microsoft products a year? When you've reached that level of maturity, you can associate variable cost to activities. Adjusting your performance levels could actually save you money or cost you money, but at least you have a story. But you can't do these until you can say what it means to change that target up or down. And hopefully that's the whole spirit of the previous slides. Is anyone doing this by chance in the room? I know it takes a high degree of overhead and passion. And one last slide. Someone once told me the only guy happy to be at a root cause analysis meeting is the security guy. I think that's about accurate. So my ask of you is to add this one extra question in your RCA, and that was, hey, was there a metric assigned to the root cause of this incident? And if there was, hey, was the target appropriate? Do we need to move this up or down? Because we have some great evidence sitting right in front of us. Or if there wasn't a metric, based on the controls that failed, is there a leading indicator that we can tie metrics to for the future and see, and then what is the target that we should set based off this evidence? So, take advantage of that opportunity when it happens. And, all right, right on time. So the goal here is to give you some specific techniques, hopefully inspire you to do a few things, follow a process that's documented, go after that evidence, don't spend money on risks, spend money on evidence collection, and then learn to accept those risks, and, in my view, be at peace. So with that, we've got just enough time for some more questions. Folks did a good job asking throughout, but any feedback?
That was very good for knowing which security controls to put in place, but do you ever use that to help inform base IT decisions that one choice may be riskier than another choice? So instead of patching holes, find things less holes.
Right, so the comment was, hey, it's good from a security standpoint. Do you ever do this from just an overall IT infrastructure? So what are the cost benefits of different IT solution? Example being, hey, one vendor is going to be more resilient, more rugged than the other one. In my experience, only in the context of kind of the consulting effort. So, we'd have a team of security folks who would get engaged in the project management lifecycle, or we would just get wind of something like, hey, we're building a new storage network. Really? Well, let's bring the security guys in. So then we would do that. The security folks would bring that this process along with them. How effective that is was determined by how effective our engagement model was. But I'm not familiar with an IT organization that it just organically has those types of questions built in. Did that answer your question? Time for one more? All right, thanks for your time.